Good day, colleagues. My name is Xander, and I'm here at the JVR Ukwanda podcast. And today we're going to speak about all things motivation and performance. But before we start with that, I'd like to make or recite a quick comment by two famous scholars in the work of work performance. And this was an article published by Campbell and Vaart, and if you've listened to previous presentations, you know that I like to frequently do this. But I'm going to read it verbatimly to you as well. Performance is the basic building block on which the entire economy is based. Without individual performance, there is no team performance, no unit performance, no organizational performance, no economic sector performance, no GDP. So it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that performance is the building block of most of what we consider to be larger productivity in groups. Now, you know that famously, or you might not know famously, but back in the middle 2000s, Meyer said that performance could be almost illustrated as an equation, where performance could be seen as a function of our ability times our motivation. Now, we'll be maybe not looking into some of those, but for this conversation, definitely speaking about both motivation and performance, and how these things are mutually reinforcing, or almost could be seen as a circle in working life. I'm very lucky to have Leoni with me here today. Leoni is a professor in industrial psychology and human resource management at the Northwest University. She holds a PhD in the field of industrial and organizational psychology at both KU Leuven and in Belgium and the Northwest University. She's also a registered counselor, registered industrial organizational psychologist, and a people practitioner with the South African Board of People Practices. Leoni, it's quite intimidating. I don't know how your CPD fees looks every year at the HPCSA.
Yeah, no, it's quite an expensive exercise, and obviously also a time-consuming exercise.
I can imagine to get all those points. Leoni has a passion for understanding employee job seeker attitudes and behavior from a motivational perspective. And I'm extremely thankful to have Leoni on the podcast today. Leoni, thank you for taking the time and welcome to Ukwanda.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Now, we often have a lot of emerging psychologists that's on the podcast, and it's interesting for them to know how people's journey in this field started. And I'd like to ask you, why did you decide to become an industrial psychologist?
Well, I actually started with psychology. I thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist, and then I realized, but I do have a very strong passion for the business side of it, and I feel that organizational psychology is a beautiful combination between, understanding people, but situating them in the business and seeing how they operate in a business environment. So that's probably the motivation behind it.
I see. So it's this at the cusp of, I think also sometimes clinical psychology might have a very strong individual focus, and comes with, I might be projecting or entirely misrepresenting the field, so all clinical or educational or counseling psychologists listening, please forgive me, but there is something to be said about industrial psychologists' focus on both the individual, group and the larger organizational level, which puts a unique spin on it. It's not only just the person that always sits in front of you that's your client.
Yes, of course, and I enjoy working in a group setting as much as an individual session. So yeah, for me that's quite entertaining.
Do you often prefer to work at the individual level or more the organizational level?
Probably more at the organizational level, because I'm a number person. So if I can take the individual and put numbers to it, and then see at an organizational level what is the impact, then I'm probably at my happiest.
Now, you've said that you enjoyed working at this cusp of both business and the individual, but you're a numbers person and you like to take aggregate things into consideration. I'm curious, if you could do anything else, what would it be?
I would probably have been a data scientist, without a doubt. Like I said, I enjoy the numbers, and taking the numbers and making a narrative of it, and then presenting that to the organization and see what the organization can then do to assist the employees to perform and feel better.
It's interesting that you say that, because my experience within psychology is that often and we call it in our field Dust Bowl empiricism, where you just randomly make connections between data points. And I think sometimes also what you train let's say if you're a data science, you train your data on, you often could be biased or misrepresent when you're actually testing your theories in the field by just looking at the data. And I wonder what your views are. Do you think we're safer by being on this cusp of practice, both theoretically understanding what the phenomena that we're working at and having explanations for what, while also looking at the data at the same time? So that either or both?
No, I think definitely it's both. I mean, you cannot start without any theoretical background, because the data can do probably anything that you would want it to do. So it must make theoretically sense, but then I would also not disregard completely the qualitative components to it, because sometimes we see something happening in the numbers but we don't really understand it, and then there's the beauty of qualitative input to see, okay, but how can we make sense of what we see in the data?
I remember a while back you invited me to a talk that a colleague, I think was it out of Denmark, who did on organizational interventions. Who was that again?
Yeah, that's Prof. Carina Nielsen, and she's at the Sheffield University in the UK.
I recall, and just linking to what you just said, that she mentioned something about that sometimes in experiments even that we do with organizational interventions, that's almost like a black box, and that you almost required to do qualitative investigations afterwards to get a sense of what the impact of an intervention is, apart from just shifts or large effect sizes that you see as a consequence of it.
Yeah, no, always. I think we should always take the numbers, put it back into context and see what makes sense, and to frame a nice narrative around the numbers, and gaining a deeper insight before we just present something to the organization or do something with the employees like interventions.
Okay. So we spoke a lot about organizational psychology now. We probably have to get to work motivation sometime, and that's a shared area of scholarly love that we both have. Would you mind to unpack this concept of work motivation for our listeners and why it is so relevant to the workplace?
Yes, so I think if we talk about motivation, it's definitely the driving force behind our behavior. So it determines in what direction our behavior will go. It will determine how intensely we engage in certain behaviors, and it will also determine how persistent we are in engaging in these behaviors. So it's really the driving force behind it. But I think if we talk about motivation, then in this way, it almost seems like the only thing that matters is quantitative motivation, so how much I am motivated. But if we look at something like the self-determination theory, they say that we should distinguish between different types of motivation. So we should look at the quality of motivation, and we can have motivation ranging from poor quality to good quality motivation. So, for example, if I can put it into context to what we are doing here today, is I could, for example, attend this podcast or participate in this podcast because you said I must do this. So, and that would be very extrinsic motivation.
Colleagues, I'm just warning, I didn't force Leoni to do this. There wasn't that much of an external force.
Yeah, so that's the far end of the continuum. And then we could say, okay, I decided to be here today, so the reason for me being here and enacting this behavior is because I would feel guilty if I don't do it after you've asked me to do it. And that we would call introjected regulation. So now it starts going into the person, but it's still not internalized. I'm still doing it because there's some shame or guilt that are attached to it. And then if we move along on the continuum, I could also be here today because I think, okay, this is important, it could add value for me and it could be meaningful. And then I have identified regulation. So now it starts becoming more internalized in the person. And then on the very far end, on the other end of the continuum, we could have intrinsic motivation. So then I am here because I find it fun, it's interesting, I enjoy being here. And if we look at the different types of motivation or the different qualities of motivation, it has a different impact on outcomes. So if something is, for example, very extrinsic, then it will have very negative outcomes for performance and well-being. And if it's on the other side of the continuum and it's very intrinsic, then it has positive outcomes. So why is it important for organizational context? Well, we want people to perform, and performance is a behavior. So if people are motivated and they have the right kind of motivation to perform, then it will have a positive impact on their performance, but also at the same time on their well-being. So if I do something because I enjoy it, so intrinsic motivation, I will feel well. Whereas if you force me to do it, I will not feel well. So it's important for performance and well-being at the same time.
I always knew that something like career interest, as an example, is related to something like work motivation, because it's interesting. I've just made an interesting connection of how it's probably already founded, but related maybe to self-determination theory. So we know that if you're very interested in a particular thing, let's take Collins-Ryasik model as an example. And if your 3-letter interest code corresponds to the typical 3-letter interest code in the job, say for example, if you're somebody that prefers things and to work with machines, and you encounter that a lot in your work, suddenly your natural interest is going to help to direct your attention, help you to, by really honing yourself on a particular task related to machines because you're naturally interested in it. It's going to help you to increase the intensity with which you pursue it, because there's a natural fit between what you are and what you are busy with doing. And of course, also persist. If you're presented with alternative things that you could do, you'll keep focused on that particular thing and persist with it independent of obstacles or diversions that's come along your way. And what I'm curious to know is, do you think that having an inherent interest in something could also increase that internal motivation on that spectrum, have a natural gravitational motivation to maybe pursue it?
Yes, of course. And I think that's where the very famous quote, I'm probably going to make some mistakes in trying to re-quote it, but it almost comes down to, if you enjoy what you do, you will never work a day in your life. So if you really enjoy something, if there's an interest in it, it's definitely going to help you to do whatever you need to do, even if it becomes challenging. You will most likely persevere due to this inherent interest in it.
What do you say is your naturally held interest in industrial psychology, given your performance or the number of scholarly works that you publish every year?
For me, it's really finding the meaning in it.
Okay.
So yes, it's interesting, but also there's meaning for me in it. If I can see that we can do research and make a difference with that research, that probably motivates me the most.
It's fascinating that you say that, because I've read an article by Roberts and Robbins on major life goals. And what they say is that it's almost like you've got values, and then in an intermediary level between values and specific goals, we have these life structures that we prefer to put in place. And that's the meaning side, along with values about things. And it's often also tied to, they don't have zero order correlations with interest. They seem to be related to interest as well. But that interest is a daily maybe expression of these deeper meaning structures that we seem to aspire to, like being known as a technical expert, or really coming to grips to solve a problem to help greater humanity. And I also think that these things are often social in nature. What motivates us, those meaning structures are by definition social. We often find ourselves in social groups as human beings. And so even becoming a technical expert or really solving those technical problems are for the sake of greater humanity. Yeah. Well, we know you've spoken about self-determination theory, but I think from a psychological need perspective that there's also some inherent things that seem to motivate people universally. I'd love to hear more about that and how it's relevant to the workplace.
Yes, so if we talk about the basic psychological needs from a self-determination theory perspective, and more specifically the basic psychological needs theory, which is a mini-theory of the SDT, then we would say we have 3 basic psychological needs. And the first one would be autonomy. So that is when people feel that what they do are in line with their interest, and they have a say or control over what they do. And we should not confuse that with independence, because independence means it's just me and I care about doing my own thing and whatever I want. But I can do what you would want me to do autonomously because I want to do what you want me to do. So it's very important to distinguish autonomy from independence, but autonomy is the first need. The second need, I would say, is the need for competence. So that is when I feel that I'm capable to do something and I'm busy mastering my environment. And then the third need would be the need for relatedness. So feeling, like you said, that sense of belonging, feeling cared for, and that I can care for others who matter for me. So those are the three basic psychological needs, and as you said, they are universal. So we find that, regardless of what culture you are in, those three needs are valued by individuals. And at the same time, we should also guard against the frustration of those needs. So sometimes we can say, I'm not really, it's not about that you do not feel perhaps included, but I actually go out of my way to isolate you, to exclude you. Then I'm frustrating your need for relatedness. At the same time, if I give you very insensitive feedback, I'm frustrating your need for competence. And the same for autonomy. If I don't allow you any part in decision making, or I don't give you any option, then I'm frustrating your need for autonomy, and we should also be careful for that.
So, Leoni, I'm quite interested. So, for example, with psychological need satisfaction, I know that you spoke about that continuum from external to internal motivation, but given what you just referred to as well, I'm curious, is it possible that somebody can also be motivated to undermine the organization, meaning that your motivation goes from a positive inherent to do the task to something where you actually start being motivated to oppose this task out of the frustration of, say, for example, these needs that are not satisfied?
Yes, and of course, then obviously it could also translate even further than that to say, okay, well, you're frustrating my need, so as a consequence of that, I'm going to go against the organizational goals, and I perhaps may start enjoying going against it. So I can also find meaning and or enjoyment in frustrating the goals of the organization. But most often, if I don't feel competent, or I don't feel that I belong, or I don't feel that I can participate in decision making, those things lead more to external regulation and the extrinsic motivation. So the more controlled type of motivation, where I do things because I feel that I have to do it. You're forcing me to do this. So example, you're forcing me to perform a certain task. So the need is being frustrated. I'm having more controlled kinds of motivation, and that will have, on the short term, perhaps good outcomes for my performance, but probably not on the long term.
What I'm also curious about is we just spoke about a few environmental factors that can influence somebody's need satisfaction, how supportive maybe leaders are, but I'm also curious, and I don't know if this might have been a question that as a somebody that studies motivation might have got a lot. Do you think that working in a virtual environment might meet some needs like competence, but frustrate other needs like, I reckon, like the need for affiliation, or how that could, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on how that could play out, and should we think about practical ways to remedy that?
Yes, I think definitely the way that the world of work has changed really needs us to rethink how do we satisfy these needs. So, for example, I think especially at the start of the pandemic, when people just quickly went over to virtual work and online work, managers, I think, initially started to do more micromanaging. So because they were so far removed from the employees, they weren't sure what the employees were busy with. So I think the frustration of autonomy through micromanagement and surveillance and checking up became quite significant. And the same goes for the need for relatedness. So I think all of a sudden we were so physically removed from one another that we probably felt like, okay, but where is the caring gone? Because now we don't frequently demonstrate it as we would do in an office environment. And all of a sudden we were forced to work with different kinds of technology, and we felt, am I so competent in using this technology? So I think the initial shift definitely was a bit big, and probably more towards the frustration of the need. As we are now adapting, we'll probably go back into the satisfaction of the need, but we would need to find different ways of satisfying the need. So I can check in with you to demonstrate care without checking up, which would frustrate your autonomy. So
Give
that for me
somebody a phone
would be
call or
yes.
I see. Yeah. So we'll have to find unique ways to start mediate or cross those virtual boundaries that's created between people. Well, in this, we've spoken about some environmental factors, but I wonder, do you think there's certain interventions that we can apply to get people to be more internally motivated or meet those basic psychological needs?
Yes, I think if we can break it down into the IGLO levels of Nielsen and colleagues, if we look at it on an organizational level, for instance, we need to reevaluate our policies and the way that jobs are designed and reflect, is it supportive of these needs? So I think on an organizational level, that would be my recommendation. On a team and a leader level, I would say that we can train colleagues and leaders to be need supportive. So, for example, as a leader or a team member, you can give people the autonomy by providing them with choices, involving them in decision making. And if you cannot provide choices or involve them in decision making, at least explain why, give them the rationale behind it. From a relatedness perspective, we can, get people to work more together, so more collaboration in a team to ensure that we have a need for relatedness, and in our interaction that we demonstrate empathy and care towards others. For competence, the way we give feedback, constructive feedback goes a long way in terms of making people feel competent, as well as scaffolding challenging tasks, because we want people to feel competent, so give them challenging tasks, but then scaffold those tasks from increasingly easier tasks to more difficult tasks. That would be on a team and a group level and a leader level.
I'm stopping you there, and I apologize. I'm curious, but that scaffolding concept is such a powerful concept, and it somehow ties into me with something like self-efficacy. It's like, just put you on a threshold where the uncertainty about a task is just enough, but still so that it doesn't overwhelm you. Yeah. And it's about that, you've experienced that sense of mastery. It's a reinforcing to your self-efficacy, yes, I can do it. And then you can go back to ever increasing and more difficult tasks, and don't get dismayed by failure too soon, but build that resilience, that self-efficacious resilience, if there is something like that, en route to taking on more complicated tasks.
Definitely. So we should not refrain from complicated tasks just because we think people will feel incompetent. We just need to manage it correctly so that they can develop that competence as we go along. And then lastly, on an individual level, what is interesting, what we've been exploring with at the moment is very similar to job crafting. We focus on needs crafting. So yes, the environment can play a huge role in how much your needs are satisfied or frustrated. But you are not a passive human being. You can also do things from your side to help you to satisfy your own needs. So look for opportunities where you can make choices and participate in decision making. Look for opportunities where you can interact with people and demonstrate your care towards them to feel more related. And also look for these challenging tasks where you can build your competence. So research are very positive at the moment in terms of need crafting and how individuals can take initiative. But of course, always, there should be a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So the organization, the team, and the leaders should do something, as well as the individual.
It's so, and I'm stepping a bit earlier, I've done some research on, I wouldn't call it autonomy supportive leadership. It's not quite that, but and it actually speaks to both psychological needs in some way as well. And we try to look at some leadership findings that seem to be predictive of goal commitment. And when I mean commitment, it's that dedication to a particular outcome that you need to achieve could also be construed as a form of motivation. And especially we looked here at what can leaders do to increase people's commitment to the goals that they need to achieve. Because a part of being a leader is setting a goal and directing people to a particular outcome. Motivating them to get from a point A to a desired point B. And we saw that the literature was quite critical about something like just participative goal setting. Didn't seem to have as much an effect as just setting a challenging goal for people. But what we interestingly discovered was that democratically, a lot of people can agree on something, but it's completely the wrong objective that they should be pursuing. And there's what we found that if you include an axis, so you've got this participative goal setting, which increases people's sense of autonomy, or their self-direction, or they feel as if they have a stake in what needs to be achieved. But interestingly also that the in the environment as a leader, what you could also do to increase that motivation is that rationality access to that. So not only do we facilitate it, but we have to keep a reasonable discussion here. And we have to make sure that what we want to achieve is both organizationally important, that it's going to meet key sort of metrics that we want to see, like profitability, but at the same time that it's practically executable and relevant. And so it seems as if by not only looking at autonomy, but also increasing the rationality of the discussion, people's expectations of the outcome being achieved also increases. And so as a consequence, I think Victor Vroom spoke about expectancy theory as another motivational theory. And that seems to be also, in addition to feeling that you have been acknowledged and that you're engaging in this relational thing that is acknowledged what you think, having a rational discussion at the same time we're introducing that increases the expectations that perhaps even related to some confidence level that the outcome would be achieved and drives motivation.
Yes, I think the right goals and STT also distinguishes between, extrinsic and intrinsic goals. So the right kind of goal matters, of course, but then, it's almost also the same as a parent-child relationship. Sometimes you know what is better for the child. And in that case, it's just about explaining why this is better and why should we do this instead of that. Then people can still see, okay, this was not my original goal, it was your goal, but I understand your goal makes sense, and therefore I willingly and autonomously go towards your goal.
Would you say that's more introjected or more completely just internalized, internal motivated type of goal?
Well,
meaning is it integrated from somebody and you make it else and you make it your own? Or to what degree is it just, because I reckon organizations will always be a form of internalizing what other people's requests are rather than just doing completely what you want to be. I think you're in a deal position if you can do completely just what you want to do.
Yes, I think initially it would probably, if we take motivation from a developmental perspective, it may start as more an extrinsic goal, then it will slightly move inside the person, but still feel like, okay, I should do this because I have to, or I want to avoid shame and guilt that goes with it. And then probably over the long term, if you satisfy the needs, you will then develop into more intrinsic motivations where you feel like, okay, it's meaningful, it's valuable, it adds value for me, and then eventually, okay, I enjoy this. And even if we don't get to the full extent of this is enjoyable, identified regulation where I see that things are meaningful and valuable is just as good for performance.
That's fascinating. I can't help myself to speak about goal setting and just think something that you mentioned also I want to revisit earlier is that we've got this idea that people are brittle and that they shy away, they're lazy, brittle, and they shy away from challenges. And what fascinated me is counter to expectation, this is a more established literature, is that people have a need for competence. And when you set goals, sometimes if you're a salesperson, if you sell, say, 30 units now and you say by December 31 units and increase it by 1 unit, that isn't really motivational. People like to be challenged. And just bumping it up a bit that is not so unrealistic that it's out of your reach, but sufficient high that it's challenging you seems to spur on. So I think we're quite cynical about our expectations of people and what they could actually achieve.
Yeah, I think we should always probably lift our expectations a little bit towards people, but in doing so, also, if I give you challenging goals and I can develop your competence, but I also give you some leeway in setting those goals and how you want to achieve those goals, then you will feel autonomous. And I feel like, and if I give you enough support and take these steps with you, then you feel that we work as a team. So all three needs are satisfied, and then I can challenge you a bit more.
Well, I also think that it's so important from whether it's introjected or internalized. In some sense, we've spoken about these broader life orientations as well. And apart from it being sufficiently challenging, perhaps if it's even linked to broader aspirations that you have in life. I know it's a difficult balance in organizations. You have to, it's a collective group and you have to compromise to achieve collective goals. But at the same time, if there's something about your broader orientation, whether you want to balance what you do at work with a family, or whether you want to become a technical expert in the field, or want to be aspiring to come into a leadership position, if it's more or less also aligned with these broader orientations, that the challenging nature of that might also be experienced as less or more effortless while you're busy with it. Okay, so Leoni, we're covering a lot of ground here, and there's several motivational theories of interest that one could pursue, and I'd encourage any person, there's a numerous amount of textbooks that one could read on the topic of work motivation, and it's surely very established. One interesting theory that we haven't covered yet is organizational justice. And I'd love to have your views first. What does organizational justice entail, and why it's so important for something like work motivation? Work performance, excuse me.
Yeah, so organizational justice, I think, is a very tricky concept because it's a perception. So it's in the eye of the beholder, and we can look at different types of organizational justice. So for example, equality in outcomes, equality in processes, equality in interaction and information. And I think especially managers have different amounts of control over the different types of justices, which means that we could, for example, have more control over how equal we interact with people, so the equality of interaction and the equality of information that are provided to individuals. But then we sometimes have, as managers, less control over the processes, because that's an organizational process. You can give input, but it's not always going to be exactly the way you want to. And then, of course, if it's equality of outcomes, especially in a performance context, is that sometimes there are performance committees that are formed that ultimately determines what the outcomes would be of the performance evaluation process. So, but I think from a managerial perspective, just because it's difficult to manage, we should not shy away from it, because we know, from example, the social exchange theory, that people will reciprocate what they receive. So if they don't feel that they are being treated fairly and justly, they're going to return that with negative behaviors. And so we need to face this head on, and I think communication is extremely important, as well as transparency. There needs to be transparency in communication, in interaction, in processes, as well as how we determine the outcome, so that people are aware of what is expected, and that they can have a sense that there's fairness towards in working towards those outcomes. But managers, we spoke a lot about how you can satisfy the needs, but I think, when we interact with people and we're trying to enhance perceptions of fairness, we need to be able to satisfy the three needs at the same time.
Yes, you've said so much, and I think one thing that really, stays with me is, given the rewards, the outcomes that you receive, or the process you used to get, it might not be always in the immediate control of, say, for example, someone like a manager, but how they interact with their subordinates. That interpersonal relationship has an element of fairness in how it's perceived. And so, you mentioned something like transparency, by giving somebody clear information about what expectations are uphand, sharing that information, and timeously communicating that to somebody could be highly motivating as a consequence of its perceived fairness, or even just interpersonally treating somebody with respect and dignity and acknowledging where they're coming from. Similar to a more participative approach that we spoke about further, could be quite motivating. And another important point that I so agree with you is, if it's not there, some people might get disenfranchised, and they want to almost balance the scales, because now I've been treated miserably. I feel as if in myself I need to restore what has been done to me, and sometimes people might do that by being counterproductive, or, I don't care, you put me through exceptionally hard work last week, I'm just going to take off whenever I like today and watch Facebook. And it could be a form of restorative, you feel like you're restoring that injustice that has been done to you.
Yes, so it would be important for managers to acknowledge, yes, I do not have control over these perceptions, but I do have control over what I do, at least to try and improve the perceptions of fairness in the organization.
I think we've covered quite a large scope of motivational theories, and this podcast is about work motivation and performance, and I think it's important that we just make that link again. So Leoni, if you wouldn't mind to unpack, how do you think work motivation is linked to this to these actions that people take in organizations to achieve goals.
Yes, and I think this is where the STT really plays an important role to say, okay, you know what, we can have a lot of motivation. So the quantity is there, but if we have the wrong motivation, it will have a negative impact on performance. So for example, we would know on a continuum that intrinsic motivation should have the most beneficial outcome for performance. So if I enjoy things and if it's interesting, that should have a very good outcome for performance. But what a recent meta-analysis interestingly found is that something like identified regulation, where something is meaningful and valuable, actually has a larger impact on performance than intrinsic motivation. So that's kind of strange if you look at the motivation continuum, but we need to remember what in identified regulation and intrinsic motivation has in common is that they are both autonomous. So identified regulation is a more autonomous form of extrinsic motivation.
I see, yes.
And that autonomous motivation still helps people to perform well. Then if we go to something like introjected regulation, where I do things to avoid shame or guilt, so I put the pressure on myself to perform, that would have interestingly positive outcomes. You would have expected negative outcomes, or perhaps insignificant or non-significant relationships between performance and motivation from that perspective. But still, interestingly, it has a positive effect on performance. Not as much as identified and intrinsic, but it still has an impact. Then also, interestingly, external regulation, where there's reward and contingencies, punishment that from other people that you want to avoid or approach, then you will also be motivated. But there's a very, very small effect from external regulation on performance. And what we need to keep in mind there is that external regulation is always bad for well-being, and well-being has a relationship with performance. So I can perhaps initially motivate you with those rewards and punishment, although to a very small extent, but then on the long term, I'm going to influence your well-being, and that will then influence your performance. So external regulation from that perspective is not very good. And then, of course, we also have...
Just to pause there. So, I mean, it's so fascinating, you can, at the one end as a manager, you can get people to do things now, but the true distinguishing, the acid test, so to speak, is how do you get people to continue doing those things and keep that momentum? So that you don't constantly have to put in the petrol.
Yeah.
I want to use the analogy of electric car, but it could potentially just keep on going on its own, which is could make you from a everyday manager to a great potential manager.
Yes, so there's always a trade-off of what gets me going versus what keeps me going, and that's the different types of motivation that will help there to manage people. But then also, of course, we get a motivation, and that means I'm not motivated at all. And a motivation is always bad, and it's bad for performance as well as well-being. So we need to stay away from a motivation.
It's incredible, given these more appropriate external motivations that's bordering on this continuum more to internal, that it almost seems as if we're still social, and there will always be external pressures placed on us that we almost naturally want to gravitate to, because that's what as a species makes us so effective, is the fact that independently we're mushy and we could be easily taken apart by predators, but by working together and having that social force exerted on us to want to collaborate seems to always be there. Whether you want to just do things on your own, there will always be some social influence on steering you in some way inevitably towards something that's good for all as well.
Yes, and also what's probably important to mention is that I can also obviously have all those kinds of motivation when I perform tasks. I will probably not only have one of them, I will have a combination of them. And then what becomes important is that I have the more autonomous type of motivation, so intrinsic and identified regulation, that I have higher levels of those than, for example, the external and the introjected form that are more controlled forms of motivation. So, yeah, I wouldn't even say a balance. There needs to be kind of an imbalance, but leaning towards the more autonomous types of motivation.
I see. So, Leoni, I'm curious. We spoke a lot about the nature of work motivation, how the environment can influence it, but if you had to give a few practical tips about what managers and practitioners can do to increase work motivation, what would those be?
I think the first important thing would be for me to work on job design, how we design the jobs in our organization. And there we need to focus on creating or designing jobs that are interesting as well as meaningful, because then we will elicit the right type of motivation. And the second thing I think would be to influence where we can HR practices that, for example, have this almost pay for performance bonus kind of approach, because we said if external regulation where it's dependent on reward and punishment does not really have a good or a large effect on performance, and on the long term it has a negative effect on performance, then we need to say, okay, but are these kind of practices in the organization ideal? And probably not. And the same goes for those the practices that stimulates introjected regulation, employee of the month. That's also not very good for performance, and especially not good for well-being and then performance on the long term. So those are the two important things that I would highlight from an organizational perspective that can be done. Then
you mentioned job design, and I'm curious what would something like that entail?
So if you design the tasks of a job, think to yourself, in what way can those tasks be interesting? So, and where can I give people leeway to, do the job in the way they want to do it, as long as they achieve the outcome? Because then it means that we have an interesting job, and also designed it in a way that, and people will create the interest in their job for that matter. But also if we look at it from a meaning perspective, so see how the job can be designed to add meaning to the individual.
You used the term job crafting earlier, and jobs are not stagnant. You can truly make it your own while still achieving the necessary outcomes. Yes,
and the organization allowing the individual to craft the job in a way that it would be need supportive. Then it would be really important, especially that brings me to my third point, to think of the job design and the way that we interact with individuals to enhance the ideal types of motivation, because it's really important when we talk about the different types of performance, which we'll get to later on. So if you, for example, want someone to just perform proficiently, task in-role performance, then you could probably go to the controlled motivation, pay for performance bonuses, employee of the month, etc. But if you want people to go to proactive and adaptive kinds of performance, then the job and the task needs to be interesting and meaningful. Otherwise, they will not go the extra mile. So it's important that the type of performance that we want to initiate in the organization will determine the type of motivation that we need to activate in our organization. Then, of course, we've spoken a lot about the needs, the different psychological needs. And earlier I alluded to how in the organization, the team, the leader, etc., can enhance need supportive behaviors and also need crafting, because the needs are the fuel for the different types of motivation. So we need to satisfy the need and avoid frustrating the needs in order for people to be optimally motivated. And then, like I said, encourage the need crafting behaviors. Allow people to craft for autonomy, the relatedness and the competence. They have the power to do something about their own jobs.
I'd love to ask you, before we just jump into interesting findings around job performance and how its structure look like, maybe we should just set the playing field first. And I'd like to know from you, what do you think is work? I know some people say job, work. I think we could probably use those interchangeably. What those things typically reflect in the workplace?
So for me, performance, individual performance would be any action that I perform to achieve the organization's goal. And that's from a positive perspective. And I can perform those tasks on an individual level, on a team level, or for the organization, but ultimately we contribute to the organizational goal. From a negative perspective, we could probably say that performance would be the counterproductive behaviors that I engage in. So anything that I do that hampers goal achievement of the organization would be the negative aspect of performance.
So almost like in personality, we have this bright and the dark side of performance as well. And so you can do something that contributes to the collective that we have to achieve, but you can also actively try to undermine that, or be, hopefully not, but motivated to throw the spanner in the wheel, so to speak.
Yes, definitely.
I think, yes, when you speak about individual actions that people take, whether it's good or bad, I often think we sometimes, when doing putting up job specifications or coming to those descriptions that we want to use, we get fixated on the small details. And I'm not saying that we should put job analysis aside. It is 100% important to know what the content of a job should be. But my suspicion is that there might be something that's general to performance, and I'd love to hear what your views on that is.
No, of course. I think obviously there are things that are perhaps specific to a job, but then I think there are also things that are independent of the job. And I think in the context that we currently operate, where people need to, for example, be proactive and adaptive, that would be across all the jobs. That would not be specific to a job. So I think there are different types of performance that would span across different kinds of jobs. I could, for example, see that some types of performance would matter more in certain jobs than in other jobs, but all kinds of performance would still be important in the job.
I can imagine that, given the context that we work in, is and it's interesting. Maybe performance has just always been complex, and we just starting to fizzle out what the numerousness of it is. So, for example, in the past, yes, you've sent me this great article by Carpini that's been published. There might have been a very strong focus on just what are the individual things that people do to get to a particular outcome. But we know more and more that people don't operate in isolation. And so, for example, they sometimes do more than what's required of them, and they collaborate with other people to achieve it. And so, and I reckon, to your point, depending on whether you work in a team or not, something like extra role or citizen behavior would become more or less important.
Yes, no, definitely.
Okay, so Leoni, we spoke about the fact that something like there might be something generic to job performance independent of the job that you do. Notwithstanding the fact that there might be more specifics to it. And I'd be interested, I think given this discussion of the broad performance dimension, that maybe if we speak about these broad generic dimensions, is there core dimensions that we've identified in literature that starts really to get well established and we've seen play out through and out all studies that has been conducted too?
Yes, I think it's important to that you mention, in the different studies, because there are obviously always different opinions and different things in different studies. But I think if we can get to kind of an agreement between, what do we all agree in terms of the different dimensions of performance, I would definitely say there are more in-role types of performance. So those are the tasks that you are expected to perform as part of your performance contract, and that is what we would call a task proficiency kind of thing. And then there are always things that we can do to go the extra mile. So the extra role performance, that which is not on your performance contract, but that you do because it's to the benefit of the organization or the team, or perhaps even yourself. So extra role kind of performance, and then that would also typically be behaviors that people will display when they have to adapt to change, and we continuously need to adapt to change. Then the third element would probably be, for me, a type of a proactive performance. And we could probably also classify it as an extra role kind of behavior, but proactively, making the changes in our job in anticipation of changes that will follow. Then I think in your recent article, I saw a very interesting component about a leadership performance, and that is not linked to me being in a managerial role and performing as a manager, but as a leader, I need to influence, or as a team member, I need to influence others so that we can achieve the team's goal. And I take a leadership position in that respect. So, a kind of a leadership performance is required probably of all people in all jobs. And then the very last thing would probably be the counterproductive behaviors that we also touched on earlier. And those behaviors could be towards the organization, or could even be towards individuals, the interpersonal side of it. But those would probably be the components that I would say.
So it's interesting, you also mentioned earlier that, and I think it's so important that we consider it, because whether you're doing your own type of ROI study, if you're using psychometrics and want to determine what the outcomes is that you're trying to predict, and if you have these core components, it's also important that you very carefully consider what the relative weight is I know that people often just calculate an overall performance score when they rank order people, or they're trying to determine whether their predictors or the assessment that they use to select people stack up to their future job performance. But what ties into that and what you give relative weight, that has a very important outcome of what you're eventually going to look for in the psychometrics that predict that. So
yes, and I think it also ties into our earlier discussion of some things may be more important for certain jobs, and we need to, adjust the weights of these different kinds of dimensions for those different outcomes.
And it still brings us back to this oscillation between it's generic, the broad that you're measuring, and sometimes, but not still keeping focus of the specific of what a job might entail of. Speaking about the specific, I am curious that sometimes we look at the sort of minute detail, the specific tasks, how many times, say for example, a doctor or a nurse monitors somebody's vitals, and my suspicion is that we get so specific in what we require managers to rate that it almost exceeds their information processing capacity or their ability to make sense of all these 133 dimensions that they have to rate on people. And might we be losing the plot in some way by doing that?
Yes, I definitely agree with that statement. I think we really overcomplicate performance evaluations at times. And not to say that, of course, the specifics are not important, but, managers are human beings and they can only deal with so much information at the same time. And now they have to observe many examples of performance behavior and try and integrate that into the performance evaluation. They are often not necessarily the experts on that behavior, but now they need to rate the behavior. So we're making it very complex for them. And I think my observation often is, and that is also what literature shows, is that a manager can observe between poor, average and good performance, and that's probably what we should be able to distinguish between, not get stuck in all of the semantics of things. And I think it's also important, so yes, cognitively they have a capacity in terms of how much information they can manage, but also they are not always exposed to all these behaviors. So how do they rate behaviors that they're not necessarily exposed to? And also not forgetting, there's always a conflict of interest when it comes to performance management.
Of course.
Because I am the manager, I'm also being rated on your performance, so I don't necessarily want to rate you poorly, etc. So, there's always a bit of a subjectivity element always to it.
We're speaking about the content of performance, but who does the performance evaluation is another interesting question. And so we know that something like 360s have been very popularized in the performance literature, but we don't always understand what the impact is of who is rating performance on how the performance ratings look like. And so, for example, we recently did a mean group comparison between subordinates' people's self-ratings versus their managerial ratings. And interestingly, we throughout saw that when you rate yourself, there's always a leniency towards yourself and an inflated, and it's not maybe it's a ego maintaining type of thing that we want to think good of ourselves and want to think of ourselves as competent. Maybe our need for competence, maybe even biases when we're rating ourselves. And so we tend to give more inflated scores to ourselves relative to our managers. And even though managers do have their biases, they might have their favorites, even though they try not to display favoritism, could impact. It seems as if they give more conservative estimates or more accurate estimates of people's performance because they're not in that person's skin, and they don't have that capacity for almost self-deception in a way when rating.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're referring to self-deception, because it's sometimes people don't rate themselves higher because they want to manage the impressions. They are deceiving themselves and they're not necessarily aware that they are doing it. The difference between impression management and self-deception enhancement is also an important and interesting element.
So when you are calculating this score on somebody's performance, it's important to consider, maybe a peer rating might be closer to a managerial rating and might be more accurate, for example, when you have to make administrative decisions for whether somebody gets promoted or rewarded. But self-ratings is still a very nice anchor to almost compare from a development perspective. This is your perception of yourself, but not everybody might have held that. And it's nice to see what the difference between those is, and you can know where you have to put in more effort to meet expectations, or where you are maybe overly critical, because that sometimes could also happen and could be. But the point that I think I want to make is that be careful of what rating source you use for what purposes, and be judicious in the choices that you make over there.
And get as much sources to rate as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, that could increase your sort of, I want to say almost accuracy, or more people, more unique observations that could be seen of the individual that you are rating. I'm going to pivot a bit and ask about, we went to the very specific, and I think there's also something to be said to the very broad. And like in other psychometrics, I know like in cognitive ability, for example, there's one strong general factor play that out. So what I mean with that is in cognitive ability, say for example, is you get a lot of mini tests, and you can do a verbal and a numerical test your mathematical ability, and a test how you read and write, and you can have a test of somebody's ability to make sense of complex, novel problems. But it seems as if you do one on the one thing, you more or less do well on all the other things. And because we see this in psychometrics, I'm wondering, is this something that we maybe see in performance measurement as well? This general factor, so to speak.
Yes, no, definitely. I think, and it's very similar to what we see in motivation. We can have a general score that measures almost the amount of something. So that would be whether someone is a high performer, an average performer, or a low performer. And I think that's very valuable from a performance evaluation perspective if you need a score for someone that are attached to promotion or bonuses, etc. But then also to be able to distinguish between the qualitatively different types of performance, we need to have specific scores for the different dimensions of performance. And for me, that is extremely valuable for developmental purposes. And performance management, in essence, should be a developmental process. So have these specific scores that are valuable for developmental purposes, but then if we want to do the actual performance rating, then a generic score is definitely valuable.
That's so interesting. I'm hovering back a bit to that article. I mentioned previously, you sent me an article by, I hope I'm pronouncing his name, Carpini, is it?
Yeah.
And what she, I don't know what the gender of the person is, said was, interestingly, that when you have this overall general factor, it can come across almost as somewhat ambiguous. Like, if you tell somebody in a performance review and in a feedback, you're a 6, what the hell does it mean, and what should I improve? And even though you have this strong general factor, having these more smaller dimensions that are practically relevant and relatable is invaluable for development purposes.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, an overall score to the individual might not mean much, but if I have specific scores for different dimensions from a developmental perspective is extremely valuable.
Yeah, that overall score might actually frustrate some psychological needs in a certain sense. You mentioned such an important thing, and the purpose of what you use, we'd be reluctant not to say this, but the purpose of what you use, performance reviews, could also impact how and that's another thing to take into mind as well. I mean, if it is in fact just done for development purposes, people might be more accurate in how they rate themselves and how other people rate them. But as soon as we're doing it, if you know it's for rewards or promotion purposes, nobody wants to give people a bad score to hold them back. We are social creatures, and we really try to accommodate other people and ourselves. And so if you do it might in general, if you want more accurate ratings, be better to do it for development purposes rather than always trying to do it for remuneration. It's a hard balance to find. I know it's difficult, but it's important to take into consideration.
No, because there's still a business that must survive at the end of the day that wants to have a 6 and a 7 out of 10, for example. But of course, at the same time, if I develop my people, they will naturally perform.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned Campbell and Vanek says, performance is other dimensions like work engagement, satisfaction, etc. are important, but without job performance, there's no job to be satisfied with, no job to be engaged with, and so it's still a contract. Think about exchange theory. Mutual beneficial to be part of an organization. You have to contribute something. At the same time, you seek to satisfy some basic, not only psychological but other type of needs as well. And we need to have both performance evaluations for remuneration purposes, but also for self-development. And there's a peculiar and judicious choice that you have to make when you implement those. But it's just important that you are aware of how those things impact ratings as well. Leoni, if you had to give managers or even sometimes practitioners that are mediators between managers and subordinates recommendations about how you can manage performance, what would that be? How would that look like?
Yeah, I think interestingly, if we read some of the literature, and I don't even want to say recent literature because I think Adobe already abolished the traditional performance evaluation system in 2012. So it's a decade later. But yeah, so I think the way that we do performance evaluation and also in the larger framework performance management becomes really important. And I think for me it would be to clarify expectations as soon as possible and as frequently as possible. So clarifying expectations is extremely important. And then to have regular performance discussions, not that once a year or twice a year, because that's after the fact, performance evaluation. So rather have real-time performance discussions where people are continuously aware of how they perform and where they can improve, or where they can even optimize. So frequent performance discussions very important. But then obviously from a motivational perspective is the way that we have these conversations should be in a way that people feel that there's autonomy, that they belong, and that they feel competent and they're making progress towards feeling competent. So the way in which I interact is extremely important, and that really can happen on a daily level. So research also shows us that managers can on a daily level influence the level of need satisfaction. So in every conversation that I have with my subordinates, I must stop and think to myself, am I supporting their needs or not? So those would probably be the main recommendations that I would have.
It's actually a cool way to integrate that psychological needs, even in your performance feedback that you're given, to have that in mind while you're busy with that.
Yes, and also from the individual perspective, so remember the manager is not the only stakeholder in this conversation. So go and ask for feedback. Ask for clarification on expectations. Make it a two-way process and not always just expecting the manager to do it. Because in that way, you're making the job of the manager easier. But of course, the manager should create such a climate, and if we want to call it a psychologically safe climate, where people feel comfortable to come and ask for feedback and to clarify expectations.
You don't want to feel like you're going to the principal's office.
Yeah. No, certainly not.
It's less like the principal's office if you initiate it. And like you say, it's an exchange and you take the initiative. And I think even for a manager, much easier if somebody displays that initiative, extra role before, and so takes that initiative to ask for feedback. It's much easier to provide it then as well. And you're probably a lot more invested also if somebody displays that willingness to develop further.
No, definitely. And it also makes your job easier in the sense that then okay, people have some insight into what is going on. So even if you have to give perhaps less encouraging feedback, the person is more open because they initiated the feedback conversation.
This has been incredible, Leoni. I would like to thank you for your time. Colleagues, I just wanted to say that Leoni is a prolific scholar. So if you're interested in reading more about her research, she's on Google Scholar and to my knowledge on ResearchGate as well. And you can find all her publications there. Please keep an eye out. There's public lectures, Leoni, if you're so fortunate. This is somebody to look out for and attend. And Leoni, I just want to thank you for your time. It's been incredible.
No, Xander, thank you for the opportunity. It's always nice to share information with the general public. Universities are usually seen as these ivory towers and we just operate in our own silo. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to engage with the public and to provide some suggestions that someone perhaps finds useful in managing performance in the organization.
Viva Scientist Practitioner.
Yes.
Thank you.